It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. The kind of morning where nothing feels special or important. The sun was coming up slowly over the hills around Northern Crossfield International Airport. The terminal was already busy. Families were standing near the departure gates, hugging each other goodbye, some of the children still half asleep, leaning against their parents with tired eyes. Business travelers were sitting in rows of plastic chairs, staring at their laptops or scrolling through their phones, not really paying attention to anything around them. Coffee cups were everywhere. Rolling suitcases were clicking across the shiny floor. The departure boards were flipping through their numbers and letters, showing destinations and gate changes and boarding times. It was a completely normal morning. Nobody was worried about anything. Nobody had any reason to be. At Gate 14, Skyhawk 412 was being prepared for its journey. The aircraft was a wide-body twin-engine commercial jet, one of the most modern and reliable planes in the Meridian Continental Airways fleet. It had been in service for several years and had logged over 22,000 flight hours, which is a lot, but well within the safe operating range for a plane of its type. Its last full maintenance check had been completed just 11 days earlier. Every system had been inspected, tested, and signed off as airworthy by qualified engineers. On paper, this plane was in excellent condition. On paper, there was nothing to worry about. The 208 passengers who boarded that morning came from all different places and were going to Crestmore City for all different reasons. Some were going home. Some were visiting family. Some were traveling for work, carrying briefcases and laptops and printed presentations they would give in offices they had never been to before. There were elderly couples, young couples, families with small children, solo travelers reading paperback novels. There was a university student returning after a semester abroad. There was a retired schoolteacher going to meet her first grandchild. There was a businessman in a gray suit who sat in row 8 and immediately fell asleep before the plane even pushed back from the gate. None of these people were thinking about danger. Why would they be? Commercial air travel is extraordinarily safe. The chances of something serious going wrong on any given flight are almost impossibly small. Everyone knows this. The crew of 6 took their positions. At the front of the plane, in the cockpit, sat Captain David Osei. He was 51 years old, a tall man with calm eyes and a quiet way of speaking that people found reassuring without quite knowing why. He had been flying commercial jets for 24 years. He had accumulated over 18,000 hours of flight time across dozens of different aircraft types and hundreds of different routes. He had handled engine problems, severe turbulence, medical emergencies in the cabin, difficult crosswind landings in bad weather, and a dozen other situations that never made the news because he handled them so smoothly that most passengers never even knew anything had gone wrong. He was exactly the kind of person you want sitting in that left seat. Experienced, calm, and deeply serious about his work without ever being dramatic about it. Beside him in the right seat was First Officer Amara Lindqvist. She was 34 years old, bright and focused, with 6,200 flight hours behind her. She had been flying commercially for 8 years and had recently passed her senior captain assessment, which meant she was on the path to commanding her own aircraft in the near future. She and Osei had flown together several times before. They had a good working relationship built on mutual respect and clear communication, which in aviation is not a small thing. A cockpit where 2 people trust each other and talk well together is a much safer cockpit than one where they do not. Behind them in the cabin, Senior Purser Dominique Reyes led the 4 remaining cabin crew members. She was 14 years into her career with Meridian Continental and had seen a lot in that time. She was known among her colleagues for being unflappable, the kind of person who stayed completely calm in difficult situations and whose calmness spread to the people around her. She had never faced anything like what was coming, but if any crew member was equipped to handle it, it was her. Skyhawk 412 pushed back from the gate at 8:39 in the morning and lifted off the runway at 8:42. The climb was smooth and uneventful. The plane rose through the low morning cloud and emerged into brilliant sunshine above. Below, The city shrank quickly and then disappeared behind the white carpet of cloud. The passengers settled in. The crew began their in-flight service. In the cockpit, the autopilot took over the routine business of keeping the plane at the right altitude and on the right heading. Captain Osei and First Officer Lindqvist monitored the instruments, checked in with air traffic control at regular intervals, and talked quietly about small things. The flight to Crestmore City was expected to take 4 hours and 20 minutes. The weather ahead was clear. There was nothing to suggest that this day would be anything other than completely forgettable. 1 hour and 42 minutes into the flight, at exactly 10:24 in the morning, Skyhawk 412 was cruising at 39,000 feet over a remote stretch of terrain far below. The outside air temperature was -57 degrees Celsius. The passengers could not feel this because the cabin was warm and pressurized, maintained at a comfortable temperature as if they were all sitting in a large living room rather than a thin metal tube traveling at nearly 900 km per hour through the upper atmosphere. Most of them had no idea how extraordinary the conditions outside the aircraft actually were, and they did not need to know. That was the point. The whole system was designed to make the impossible seem completely routine. At 10:24, a small amber warning light appeared on the instrument panel in the cockpit. It was a fuel imbalance warning. This light was indicating that the fuel levels between the different fuel tanks in the aircraft were becoming uneven, which can affect the balance and performance of the plane. Captain Osei looked at it with a frown. Fuel imbalance warnings are not always serious. Sometimes they are caused by faulty sensors rather than actual problems with the fuel. He told First Officer Lindqvist to run the fuel balance checklist. She began working through it carefully and systematically, the way she had been trained to do, pressing the right buttons and checking the right readings in the right order. But as she worked, something became clear that changed everything. The fuel level in the central tank was not just slightly off. It was dropping rapidly. Much more rapidly than it should have been. Fuel was leaving the tank at a rate that had nothing to do with normal engine consumption. The plane was losing fuel, leaking it somewhere, and the leak was serious. This was not a broken sensor. This was a real emergency. Before they had fully processed this information, a second alarm sounded. Engine number 2, the right engine, was showing critically low fuel pressure. The engine was being starved of the fuel it needed to keep burning. Osei immediately took manual control of the aircraft and told Lindqvist to contact air traffic control. He began working through the engine failure procedures he had practiced hundreds of times in the simulator, his hands moving with the precise economy of someone who has rehearsed every step so many times that the movements are almost automatic. He was completely focused. He was also, underneath that focus, beginning to understand that this situation was more serious than anything he had faced before. 90 seconds later, engine number 2 flamed out. The right engine simply stopped. The sound changed immediately and dramatically. The deep, powerful roar that passengers had been hearing without really hearing it, the constant background note of the flight, dropped away on the right side. The plane yawed to the right, pulled by the asymmetric thrust, and Osei corrected it with the rudder, pushing left with his foot to keep the nose straight. The autopilot disconnected with a sharp warning chime, handing full control back to the pilots. Now Osei was flying the aircraft manually, on one engine, at 39,000 feet, with a serious and unresolved fuel problem somewhere in the system. A single-engine situation is serious, but it is manageable. Pilots train for it. There are clear procedures. The aircraft is certified to fly on one engine. The remaining engine is more than capable of keeping the plane in the air long enough to divert to the nearest airport and make a safe landing. Difficult, yes. Frightening for the crew, certainly. But survivable. Commercial aviation history has many examples of successful single-engine landings. This was a serious problem, but it was a solvable one. And then First Officer Lindqvist looked at the fuel pressure reading for engine number 1, the left engine, and her face changed in a way that told Osei everything before she said a single word. The left engine was also losing fuel pressure. The same fractured fuel line that had killed the right engine was now draining the tanks that fed the left engine too. Within 2 minutes of the first engine going silent, the second engine began to lose power as well. It coughed, surged, and then stopped. Skyhawk 412 was now at 39,000 feet with 214 people on board, and it had no engines at all. Lindqvist declared a mayday. Her voice was controlled and precise, which under the circumstances was an act of tremendous professional discipline. She gave air traffic control their call sign, their position, their altitude, and a clear statement of the situation. Both engines had failed. They were declaring an emergency. They needed immediate vectors to the nearest airport capable of accepting a wide-body aircraft. The controller who took the call was Sandra Hayes, a senior controller with 19 years of experience. She acknowledged the mayday immediately, began clearing all other traffic from the area, and started looking for options. The nearest airport with a long enough runway was Fairdale Regional, 112 miles away on a bearing of 240 degrees. She asked if they could make it. Osei told Lindqvist to tell her they were calculating. They needed a moment. What Osei was calculating was the glide ratio of his aircraft. When a plane loses all engine power, it becomes a glider. A very large, very heavy, very imperfect glider, but a glider nonetheless. The wings still generate lift as long as the plane is moving forward through the air. The question is how long that forward movement can be maintained given the inevitable loss of altitude. A commercial airliner in a clean glide configuration travels roughly 17 miles forward for every mile of altitude it loses. At 39,000 feet, with Fairdale 112 miles away, the mathematics were extremely tight. There was almost no margin for error. Osei had to fly the aircraft perfectly and he had to do it entirely by hand, without engines, managing his airspeed and his descent rate with the kind of precision that leaves no room for mistakes. He told Lindqvist to tell Hayes they would attempt to reach Fairdale. He began setting up the aircraft for the most efficient possible glide. Every decision from this moment forward would be made with one question in mind: how do I keep this plane in the air long enough to reach that runway? The first urgent task was to restore some electrical power. With both engines dead, the aircraft's main electrical generators were offline. The instruments, radios, and flight controls all needed power to function. Lindqvist deployed the ram air turbine, a small propeller that is stored in the belly of the aircraft for exactly this kind of emergency. When deployed, it swings down into the airstream and uses the flow of air past the moving plane to spin a small generator. It cannot produce much power, nothing close to what the engines normally provide, but it is enough to keep the most essential systems alive. The primary flight displays came back on. The radios stayed live. The flight controls maintained partial hydraulic pressure. They could still steer. They could still see where they were going. It was not much, but it was enough to work with. Osei then attempted to restart both engines. This is called an air start, and it involves using the remaining heat inside the engine and a high-energy ignition spark to try to relight the combustion process even without a reliable fuel supply. He tried engine number 1 first. The engine spooled up slightly, there was a brief flicker of activity, and then nothing. He tried engine number 2. Same result. Brief hope, then silence. The fuel line fracture had drained too much of the fuel supply. There was simply not enough left to sustain combustion. The engines were not coming back. They were going to have to glide all the way to Fairdale and land without any power at all. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers had noticed the change. You cannot lose 2 jet engines at 39,000 feet without the people sitting in the back noticing. The sound had gone wrong. The constant background roar that passengers tune out within minutes of takeoff is so deeply embedded in the experience of flying that its absence is immediately and deeply unsettling. People looked up from their screens. They looked at each other. They looked out the windows and saw that the engines were not moving. The fan blades were still. One man pressed his face to the window and stared at the right engine for a long moment, completely unable to understand what he was seeing. An engine that is not running on a plane that is still in the air is a thing the brain does not know how to process. It does not fit into any category of normal experience. Dominique Reyes called the cockpit. Osei told her the truth, quickly and directly, because she needed the facts in order to do her job. Both engines had failed. They were gliding. They had identified an airport and they were going to make it. She needed to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing right now. Dominique said understood and put the phone down. She looked at her colleague Marco for exactly 1 second, just long enough for them to acknowledge to each other without words what they were facing, and then she went to work. What followed in the cabin over the next hour was a quiet, sustained act of professionalism that was just as important as anything happening in the cockpit. Dominique and her team moved through the aircraft systematically, row by row, speaking calmly and clearly to every passenger. They told people to tighten their seatbelts. They removed loose items from the aisles. They instructed passengers to take off glasses and remove sharp objects from their pockets. They explained that the plane would be making an emergency landing at a nearby airport and that everyone needed to follow the crew's instructions carefully. They used calm voices and steady eye contact and avoided saying anything that would cause immediate panic, because they understood that panic in a confined space with 208 frightened people in it could become its own kind of disaster. Some passengers took the news with remarkable composure. Others began to cry. Some prayed in languages that mixed together across the rows, Arabic and Spanish and Mandarin and English all rising quietly in the recirculated air of the cabin. A man in seat 24F named Thomas Backer took out his phone and called his wife. He told her he loved her. He told her to tell their children he loved them. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, closed his eyes, tightened his seatbelt, and waited. A young woman in row 31 held the hand of the elderly stranger in the seat next to her, and the elderly stranger held back without saying a word. The university student in row 19 pulled his headphones off and sat very straight in his seat, staring at the back of the headrest in front of him with wide, frightened eyes. Dominique Reyes walked the aisle one more time, checking every passenger, making eye contact, touching shoulders, saying the same calm words again and again. Her own heart was hammering. Her own hands wanted to shake. She did not let them. In the cockpit, Osei and Lindqvist were working with intense, quiet concentration. The plane was descending steadily. Every minute that passed, they were getting lower. They could not stop the descent. They could only manage it, trying to maintain the optimum airspeed for maximum glide range, trying to keep the aircraft perfectly on course for Fairdale, trying not to lose any altitude they did not have to lose. Sandra Hayes kept her radio open and kept talking to them. She gave them regular position updates. She told them about the wind at Fairdale, which was calm, a small mercy. She told them the runway was being cleared and that fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue crews were all positioning themselves on the airfield. She told them that every piece of equipment available was being deployed. She told them, simply and directly, that they were not alone. Lindqvist said later that Hayes's voice during those long minutes of descending silence was one of the things that helped her stay focused, that having another human being on the radio who was completely committed to helping them made the situation feel slightly less impossible. As the plane descended through 19,000 feet, then 15,000, then 11,000, the landscape below was becoming visible. Hills and valleys and roads and the scattered pattern of small towns. And somewhere ahead, still too far away to see clearly, the thin gray line of a runway. Osei asked Lindqvist for their exact glide calculation. She gave it to him. They were going to make it, but barely. The margin was very small. There was no room for a single wrong decision. At 6,200 feet, the runway at Fairdale Regional appeared in the windscreen. It looked impossibly small from this distance, a narrow strip of gray in a flat valley, and yet it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. Osei began setting up for the approach. In a normal powered approach, if the aircraft comes in too high or too fast, the pilot simply reduces thrust and the plane slows down. If it comes in too low, the pilot adds thrust and climbs back up. And if something goes seriously wrong at any point, the pilot can push the throttle all the way forward, climb back into the sky, circle around, and try the approach again from the beginning. A go-around, in pilot language. A second chance. Osei had no throttle to use. There would be no second chance. This one approach had to work perfectly, first time, or it would not work at all. He deployed the landing gear manually, pulling a special release handle that allowed the heavy wheels to fall free under gravity and lock into position without hydraulic pressure. He felt and heard 3 heavy thuds as the main gear and nose gear locked down. 3 green indicator lights appeared on the panel. Gear down and locked. He lowered the flaps in stages to increase lift and slow the aircraft. He used the spoilers, panels on the upper surface of the wings that can be raised to disrupt the airflow and increase drag, to manage his descent rate when he found himself coming in slightly too high. He was making dozens of small adjustments every minute, his hands and feet working constantly, reading the instruments and looking at the runway and feeling the aircraft through the controls with the intuition that comes only from thousands of hours of experience. At 400 feet above the ground, he was on the center line of the runway, on the correct glide path, at the correct airspeed. It was not luck. It was the result of an hour of precise, careful, exhausting work by 2 people who refused to give up. He told Dominique over the interphone to initiate brace commands. Her voice came over the cabin speakers, clear and steady: brace, brace, head down, stay down. She said it 3 times. In the cabin, 208 people bent forward, hands locked behind their heads, faces pressed toward their knees, holding on to what they had left of their ordinary Tuesday morning. At 20 feet above the runway, Osei pulled back gently on the controls to raise the nose slightly, a maneuver called the flare, designed to slow the rate of descent and soften the touchdown. The main wheels made contact with the runway at just over 150 knots, which is fast but within limits. The impact was hard enough to feel throughout the entire aircraft, a heavy jarring thud that shook the overhead lockers and caused several passengers to gasp or cry out. The nose wheel came down a moment later with a loud bang. And then Osei pressed the brakes with everything he had. Without reverse thrust from the engines, braking on Skyhawk 412 that day was purely a matter of the wheel brakes pressing against the tires against the tarmac. The tires screamed. The smell of burning rubber was immediate and intense. The runway lights blurred past on either side. The end of the runway was coming. And then, gradually and then more quickly, the aircraft slowed. It slowed and slowed and slowed, and it stopped. It stopped with 380 meters of runway left. In the cockpit, neither Osei nor Lindqvist spoke for several seconds. Osei later described listening to the silence after they stopped, the complete absence of engine sound, no alarms, no warnings, just the soft hiss of wind across the windscreen. Then Hayes's voice came through the radio, asking them to confirm they were stopped. Osei picked up the radio and said yes. They were stopped. On the ground. Everyone alive. Hayes replied that emergency services were rolling and that it was outstanding work, Captain. Her voice was professionally composed, but those who listened to the recording later said they could hear in it the sound of someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had only just been allowed to breathe. In the cabin, the moment the aircraft stopped there was a fraction of a second of absolute silence, the whole plane holding its breath together, and then noise erupted. People were crying, laughing, calling out names, pressing their faces into the shoulders of strangers they had never met and would never see again after today. Dominique Reyes stood at the front of the cabin and for the first time in over an hour her hands were shaking. She let them shake. She had earned it. Of the 214 people on board Skyhawk 412 that morning, 7 suffered minor injuries in the landing. Cuts, bruises, 1 case of whiplash. Every single other person walked off that aircraft without a scratch. In the entire history of commercial aviation, a successful outcome from a total dual-engine failure at cruise altitude is extraordinarily rare. Most of the cases in the record books end very differently. What happened at Fairdale Regional Airport on that Tuesday morning in March was, by any honest measure, a miracle of skill and determination and human steadiness under the most unimaginable pressure. The investigation that followed took 11 months and involved more than 140 specialists from across the aviation industry. They found what they were looking for in the fuel system of Skyhawk 412. There was a fracture in the main fuel feed line, a crack less than 1/3 of a millimeter wide at its widest point. Under the standard inspection lighting used in the maintenance hangar, at the angle and intensity at which those lights were positioned, the crack was effectively invisible. It had been there for some time, growing slowly with each flight cycle as the metal expanded in the heat of the ground and contracted in the freezing cold of the upper atmosphere, over and over, until on that Tuesday morning at 39,000 feet it finally gave way completely and drained the tanks faster than anything could stop it. Nobody was found to be negligent. The engineers who had inspected the plane had used the tools and procedures they were required to use, and those tools and procedures had not been enough to find a fracture that small. The investigation concluded that the failure was a systems failure, not a human one, a gap in what the inspection process was capable of detecting rather than a failure of the people doing the inspecting. But the world of aviation changed because of Skyhawk 412. New inspection requirements were written into international safety regulations within 6 months of the final report being published. UV fluorescence inspection equipment, which can reveal tiny metal fractures invisible to normal light, was made mandatory for all fuel system components during major maintenance checks. The criteria for classifying fuel system defects were revised and tightened significantly. And the requirement for dual-engine failure simulator training, which had previously been an annual exercise, was changed to quarterly. 4 times a year, not once. Because the people who wrote those new regulations understood that the thing which had saved 214 lives on that Tuesday morning was not just luck and not just skill, but preparation. The thousands of hours of training that had put exactly the right knowledge into Captain Osei and First Officer Lindqvist's hands at exactly the moment they needed it most. Captain David Osei continues to fly. He also spends a significant part of his time now as an instructor in the simulator, working with younger pilots on emergency procedures and crew resource management. He is said to be a patient and precise teacher who never raises his voice and never makes his students feel small for making mistakes, because he understands that making mistakes in a simulator is exactly what a simulator is for. At the end of every emergency procedure session, he always says the same thing to the pilot sitting in front of him. Checklists save lives. Communication saves lives. And never, never, never give up on the aircraft. The pilots who have trained with him write those words down. Some of them have them memorized before they ever meet him, because they have heard the story of Skyhawk 412 and they know those words were not spoken in theory. They were spoken by a man who proved them true at 39,000 feet on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, with 214 lives in his hands and no engines in his wings and a runway 112 miles away that he was absolutely, completely, and unwaveringly determined to reach.